if you are someone with a fearful avoidant attachment style, or if you're in a relationship with someone who has a fearful avoidant attachment style, you may have noticed something that's sort of like being hot and cold in the moment, perhaps particularly in a moment of intensity, during an argument. So, what can you do about this? Like, what's going on there, and what can be done about this hot and coldness that can be really challenging? Hey everyone, I'm Sonia. Welcome to my channel where I give you tips on healing your attachment style or dealing with it strategically and other life tips for having the best life and relationships. And if you want any extra help with anything, go ahead and check out below where you can find out about having a 20-minute consultation. I do coach people, but I also might be able to point you to other resources as well. Okay, so really quickly, what's happening here when a fearful avoidant goes, usually it's like they're hot first in the sense, and when I say hot, I mean like connected, right? Like it might be in the intensity of an argument, so they might be really intense, but they're more like going towards you, and then suddenly there's this shutdown and they want to withdraw or push you away. That's the cold. And then it often comes back around, varying amounts of time, but it comes back around again. And then they were just pushing you away, and suddenly they're back to wanting to connect again, or get back into it. And so that's why it can feel so dramatic, is because sometimes it's within a fairly short space of time that it goes back and forth like that. It does vary in time, but it can feel like just such a different state that they're in from one to the other of that. And I should say I'm a healed fearful avoidant, so I'm very familiar with this. So I'm going to try to sort of explain how that felt a little bit as I go into some of the points here. But so why is it? So a fearful avoidant is going to, we sometimes say that they're a combination of anxious, preoccupied, and a dismissive avoidant attachment style, and then with some of their own traits. But really, they're not holding both of those at the same time at any given moment or in any given relationship. And so they're likely to be, more in their anxious mode or more in their avoidant mode at any particular time. So what's happening here, let's give the context of an argument, because this is very often when this would happen. So let's say that they're really in the argument. Maybe they're the one who brought up the issue in the first place. And, they're really like trying to push for the change or whatever's happening. And at some point, it's like they're tipped over some edge, and then suddenly they're cold and they're pushing you away. They're not wanting to connect. They're wanting to withdraw. They're being very cold in their tone and manner, for example. So what happened there is that potentially they got triggered. So they could have had a specific core wound that was triggered. But they also may have reached just some sort of pain point, right? So it could be specifically a core wound, and often a pain point will touch on that. But something just got too painful, right? And so what's happening is that withdrawing and going to the dismissive avoidant mode is for them, particularly for the fearful avoidant who does this in the moment, more than really for a dismissive avoidant who is more, overall long term looks this way. They're flipping into that because it's a protective thing, really, right? So I will say, as the person who is the fearful avoidant, it didn't feel that way to me. It just felt, kind of on one level mystifying, because I could sort of on some level know that I'd switched like that, and it felt confusing as to why I'd switched, but I really was there, and suddenly this cold feeling where I felt like I wanted to disconnect. That's really what I wanted. I wanted to withdraw. Felt like I cared even less about the relationship, I would say. Like, it just really was this shutdown and switch into that kind of a mode, which can be really confusing, to the person themselves, and certainly to their partner or whoever it is that they're engaged with. And so, I think that hopefully explains why that happens. That they flipped into that mode. And because it's more of a triggering, it's going to be different amounts of time that it takes to come back. But sometimes, like for me, if it was like in the course of an argument, I'd feel like when I was in that shutdown mode, like it was going to last forever. Really forever. But it can sometimes come back online really fast. Like I think for me, probably it was only like 10 or 15 minutes. And then I would be feeling just the opposite again. I wouldn't be in the heat of the moment of the argument the same way, but I would flip into feeling really anxious and wanting to connect, like really more into almost that, non-healed AP sort of anxious preoccupied sort of way, like wanting to reach for the person, wanting comfort, that they wouldn't abandon me, even though I just pushed them away myself, right? So you can see how that is so confusing, but that's the pattern, right? Because it's this hurt or the trigger that's happening, and it's this self-protective mechanism coming down. And then when that fades, which it will eventually, then there's the other concern, partly because they know what they did. I knew what I had done and had pushed away. So then it made me like, because I wasn't in the dismissive avoidant mode anymore, or the avoidant mode, then I really, really wanted to connect, because I didn't like what had just happened when I was in that mode with the shutting down and the withdrawing. So hopefully that shows you sort of how and why it happens. And often, fearful avoidants have often, not always, everyone's path is a little different, but it has gone through something when they were a child, or, that kind of thing. And so when it hits these pain points, that self-protection coming in can be pretty intense, right? Because there is that background often. So what can you do about it? Like how can one handle this? I mean, it's most ideal, of course, for the fearful avoidant person to be healed, which is totally possible. Like I said, I healed from it. And that's a lot of the coaching work I do now is around helping people heal their attachment styles. But let's just take it out of that really longer, bigger picture context here for a moment. So what can one do? So let's go from the perspective of the partner first. Or the person dealing with them in the relationship. So the biggest thing is to just understand this, right? Because it looks so dramatic. It looks so intense and sort of shocking in a way. So I think sort of normalizing it in the sense that you do understand the attachment style now, and that it's understandable, right? Like you might even expect it to happen. Like, oh, if we have an argument at some point, this might happen. Can really go a long way, that understanding towards things getting better. So the next thing that is important to do is to reassure the person. So let's say they did go into that more dismissive or withdrawing mode. Reassuring them that you're still there for them, while also respecting that they really are for real in that mode. And so you're respecting that they need to withdraw, not taking it personally, hopefully as personally, because you understand it now. So respecting it, but having those words that are saying that you're still there for them, we'll connect again as soon as you're feeling up to it, that kind of thing can really go a long way, because not so easy in the heat of the moment sometimes, right? But if you're able to do that, it's really helpful, because then it helps with, it helps the person they're going to hear, even if they can't fully take it in, they're going to hear those words. And particularly as they start to come out of that mode and are coming back towards the connective mode, it will help to ease that they don't feel so immediately anxious. And so that they're not just then immediately as far into the anxiety or feeling like you're, going to abandon them because of what just happened, and even with the withdrawing. So that is really helpful, and a connective thing, even though it's going to feel like it doesn't get through immediately. And again, to try not to take it personally, both because you understand overall the style, their fearful avoidant attachment style, but also because you understand that this specific thing, this withdrawing and pushing you away, is part of that and part of the process and how it goes. Okay, and so another thing that you can do as someone who is in relationship with a fearful avoidant person who is going into their from hot to cold, flipping into dismissive avoidant mode, is to understand that they're suppressing something, that they are they're going to have needs and things that they may have been suppressing also. So sometimes that also can be why they flip faster into that mode. Like, let's say they've been asking for something and they really let it build up that they should have been asking you for the need earlier. That could even be why they go into that hurt mode, is because they built it up so much that then if you don't immediately, which is unreasonable if they haven't been communicating, but if you don't immediately, you kind of, let's say they take it as you rejecting that need, or that you're going to help them with it, because it got so built up within them first, that could be more of a hurt to them then, right? And how it's perceived, and then flip them into that more easily. And that's, of course, not your fault at all. They weren't communicating it. But if you can proactively, both in the moment, say, hey, maybe we can work on that need, if you can get that out. in the heat of the moment. That can be helpful. And then you're going to, of course, negotiate it with yourself in mind too when you do. But also more proactively, if you can sort of know that there's going to be that tendency where it builds up for them, and try to communicate with them about things proactively ahead of time, sort of encouraging them, letting them know that you're available and open to that. Like sometimes that doesn't get through immediately. Like you might say that to someone for a while. Like let's say you say it for months here and there, and then finally they open up to you eventually, about something more proactively. That can be a great thing. And so the next point really is related to that, to what I just said, because um, what you don't want to do is mistake the way in which fearful avoidants are so connective and really like to talk about deep topics. They often don't prefer us superficial conversations. They like to go into depth with things, not confusing that for them really sharing their deepest vulnerabilities. So like if it looks like, oh, but they're so deep all the time, and oh, they do talk about a lot of things that are very, reflective about themselves, for example, doesn't mean that they're still sharing the hardest thing that they need to share. And so still saying that, like, hey, like really I'm here for you, whatever you ever want to share, those kinds of things can go a long way towards proactively helping them to start to divulge some of that they still are protecting. And then finally, just being mindful of their core wounds if you have a sense of what they are. So like I said, often it's a core wound that's triggered, that causes this hot cold moment. And so if you have a sense of what those are, like I've said this in many other videos, in many other contexts, if we have a sense of what the other person's core wounds are, we can be more sensitive around it. Doesn't mean we have to completely walk on eggshells, and we certainly don't want to abandon our own needs and our own negotiating within the relationship. But it's just helpful to be mindful of that. And so, for example, there's many different core wounds that a fearful avoidant can have, particularly because they often have some. It's going to be different for everybody, the exact ones they have, but they'll have some that are also the ones that anxious preoccupied have, and they'll also have some that dismissive avoidants have, as well as some of their own. But very common one, like with all anxious attachment styles and avoidant attachment styles, is I am unsafe. So, that sense of safety is important. And that can be emotional safety too, right? So if so for example, with that, if they've divulged something very, very vulnerable, like with anyone, but perhaps especially for someone who's fearful avoidant, or has any really insecure attachment style, really important to receive that in a way that then doesn't immediately trigger a core wound if they feel like it's not received well. But another one, I'll just give one more example that's very common, particularly for fearful avoidance, is I will be betrayed. So if you can be mindful of that it's a core wound, it's like not to do with you specifically. They can't help it. They're coming to with that core wound, particularly until it's healed. And there are ways to heal it. So that's again something that they could do, but it may always be there to some extent. And so if you can know that, then you just would be more mindful of things that for example, that you'd be more transparent. Fearful avoidance particularly appreciate transparency because of that. Like they can't help it that they're often feeling like something will be a betrayal of some form. And so therefore, it's really helpful to understand that if they need transparency, perhaps you can just proactively offer it, right? So then it doesn't feel like, if you feel invaded by that, for example, because that can be hard for people because they're going to have their own style and needs and things. And so if you feel like you really don't like to have to say everything, of course you can negotiate around that, but understanding that it's a real thing for them, right? So it does need to be negotiated around, and offering that can be really helpful. But in general, just sort of being mindful of core wounds. So that can be proactively, like I talked about, and being transparent. It can be also in the moment, if you see a core wounds about, could be potentially triggered, to try to watch your words a bit, or say things more mindfully. So that is my other big tip for how to deal with this whole hot cold thing that a fearful avoidant may have when you're especially in an intense conversation or argument with them. So, what about if you're the fearful avoidant yourself? What can you do about this? Well, again, a lot of it is around understanding this because it can feel really confusing and like you don't know what to do with yourself. Here you are, this person who feels pretty often reflective about yourself in your inner world, and then like what is happening here when this happens? I mean, it was very confusing to me when it used to happen. I feel like it was this huge area that I didn't understand about myself, and it just felt so perplexing as to why. And so understanding it's coming from the fearful avoidant attachment style, understanding that it's coming from the triggering of core wounds, all of that can go a long way towards getting through it, even if it does happen in the moment. And along those lines, if you are the fearful avoidant yourself, trying to explain your attachment style and exactly how this plays out to your partner is very helpful so that they will understand too what's happening. Even if it's not ideal, you prefer it doesn't happen, having that understanding will help them not personalize it, for example. And then, like I mentioned, for the partner or person in the relationship with the fearful avoidance, being mindful of the core wounds. Well, if you know your core wounds, if you can let them know what those are, that also can go a long way towards proactively, letting them know both something to be mindful of, but also like if they see that that was triggered, then they'll have an understanding of that as well. That's another way that the understanding piece plays in, is if you can share core wounds with them. And I gave that example of the I will be betrayed core wound and that fearful avoidance often need transparency. So how that would look from your end is if that's transparency something you're asking for, really explaining that root of where it's coming from. It's not you, it's me. It helps me to feel safe in a relationship, and it's really based on my background, not you. But I would appreciate if you can help me out so I, just don't get triggered so easily. And then taking a stance of negotiating around it can really be a helpful way to address it. So another tip, if you are the fearful avoidant yourself, who is having this flipping from anxious into avoidant and back again, is to work on your system regulation, on regulating your system. And so that sounds impossible when you're in the moment doing it. So part of it is to work on that in general, so you have those skills available to you in the moment more so. But I think that it can. What's a really key point for this exact process of this flipping into avoidant and back is to understand that when you're in that avoidant mode, you are still dysregulated. And I say that because when you're in it, it feels almost like supernaturally calm. Like it feels, especially compared to the intensity that you were just feeling, it feels like this calculated, like cold, calm feeling. But you actually were triggered into it and you're in this protection mode. So you actually are dysregulated. So it's important to understand that. And so even though you feel that almost it's sometimes it almost feels a little dissociated, honestly, too. Like I can say that to me it did. If I really think about it in retrospect and having experienced other dissociation. So understanding that it's still important to work on the body regulation, but system regulation, nervous system regulation is what I mean when I say body, can actually be helpful. So not only doing it overall, but like if you notice that you're starting to flip into DA, and often it happens fast, so you might already be in it, just realize, hey, I am actually like dysregulated right now, and see if you can do some of those techniques, even though it doesn't feel like you need them right in that moment. And certainly use them as you're coming out of it, or if you flipped back into the anxious style. And that'll feel more natural to use them in that case. So hopefully that sort of overall understanding of what's going on when a fearful avoidant flips from more anxious into avoidant and then back again at some point. It's just what's going on there. Hopefully that was helpful to understand that. And then a few of those tips, both for if you are the one in relationship with the fearful avoidant doing that, or if you're the fearful avoidant yourself. And then I want to end this just with that hope that this can be dealt with. It feels so, like I said, dramatic and confusing and intense in the moment. And really the understanding, and especially, of course, the healing, if you're willing to go on that journey of healing core wounds and healing the attachment style more generally, can go a long way. But knowing that to whatever extent you're working with it, whether it's full on going into the healing or whether it's just taking that understanding into each moment and making those, arguments or those intense moments feel less intense, that's all going to really, really help. And it's all possible and has been done by many people, including me. So definitely take heart. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions. And thanks for watching.